another great pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Wanda Skowronska. She's a lady from Australia. She's an educational psychologist living and working in Australia. She works with children, does pro-life counselling for the Family Life International in Sydney, and writes for Annals. She also is a sessional lecturer with the John Paul II Institute in Melbourne. I've had the pleasure of meeting Wanda some years ago because I have a daughter who lives in Sydney, Australia, and on one of our visits to our daughter there, we had the great joy of being taken along and meeting Wanda. She's going to tell you some marvellous things, and the title of her talk is here, The Flexible Gender and Fanciful Selves. She will explain. Thank you, Wanda.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Claude. And excuse me for a bit of a raspy voice. I think a London bug got hold of me about a week ago. I always feel a bit embarrassed coming as a psychologist in front of people because psychologists don't have a good reputation with Catholics. And I always say, well, maybe if I say a joke or two, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? None, because the light bulb really has to want to change, you know. And then how many people with narcissistic personality disorder does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the world has to revolve around the person while he does it. But the thing is, psychologists can be nice people, and if they're, you know, trying to understand the human being, please don't hold it against them that they can't understand everything about the human person. Give them credit for the fact that they try to understand and they're making an effort to do it. I know that there have been a lot of problems lately, and one of the, with psychology and the understanding of the human person, and particularly in the area of gender and the same-sex marriage issue and so on. But while there's been a lot of focus on same-sex marriage, there's really a dark horse behind all of that. That's only one part of the entire agenda, and I call it the politically correct apologencia. You know, we're living in a world of such ironies where the Russian president, a former KGB agent in a system dedicated to destroying the Judeo-Christian order, declares he wants to protect Russian children from adoption by gay couples because it's unnatural and against the Christian values of his people. On the other hand, the United States Episcopalian Convention has approved transgenders to become clergy and now has introduced anti-discrimination language for transgender church members. You're not allowed to offend transgenders in any way. Western Europeans and other people around the world feel paralysed in the face of the assertion that gay marriage is a human right. And there's been a wholesale attack on the notion of being male and female. Recently in the United States, a ruling by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission made what is known as transgender a protected status under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This means not only are transgenders recognised, but also, as a Catholic moral theology professor, Christian Brugger, states, a baffling multiplication of categories of sexuality now claim rights, including transsexualism, transvestism, bigenderism, genderqueerism, pansexuality, to name a few. As Brugger, who is a senior fellow at the St. John Vianney Seminary in Denver, Colorado, further explains, transgender is a catch-all term referring to all persons who don't identify with their sex. And within this umbrella, bigenders are those who alternate between being masculine and feminine on different days. Transvestites find satisfaction in dressing in clothes of the opposite sex, and genderqueers refer to persons who do not identify themselves as either male or female, some feeling they're both male and female, some feel they're neither male nor female and believe they're a third gender, and some believe they're no gender. This is now in the process of being legalised. A Reuters news story on March the 23rd, 2011 was entitled "Transgender New Yorkers Sue Over Birth Certificates." And why? Because they didn't want to go through the burdensome proof of showing papers where they had had operations to change gender. They just wanted a letter from a GP saying, he's changed. He was a male yesterday, female today. Get used to it, live with it. Much of this is an offshoot of the Marxist-inspired view that sought not only to eliminate economic classes, but also sex classes, seeing gender as a social construct, and that you could be anything you wanted to do according to the society in which you're in. Now, I'll just show you, that's a chameleon who even changes colours but doesn't change his gender in any way. But this is a quotation by Kate Bornstein, who said, "Doing away with gender is key to doing away with patriarchy. Gender fluidity is the ability to freely and knowingly become one of, or many, of a limitless number of genders for any length of time. Gender fluidity recognised no borders or rules of gender." You see, it's got nothing to do now with being gay and straight. Gender fluidity sees that as passé. It's now the choice of any social construct you choose to be. In Australia recently, a man won the right in the Supreme Court to be recognised as no gender. The first time. It's called neutre, because he doesn't want to be any gender. So what do you feel like being today? Man, woman, genderqueer or neutre? Well, yes, if you don't feel like anything at all, well, you might be like that Sydney resident, Norrie, who declared he was no gender, and he said, "I squealed a squeal of delight. It's very thrilling, very exciting. I'm now a non-specific sex." Now, there's Kate Bornstein, who wrote about this, and Kate Bornstein was born at Albert Bornstein and has lived a life as Kate ever since. Pope Francis I had some things to say. That's him after the conclave. They're in St. Peter's Square. They're meeting Pope Emeritus Benedict. He said the gender ideology is demonic. And Pope Emeritus Benedict said the profound falsehood of this theory and of the anthropological revolution contained within it is obvious. What people in the gender ideology movement and the dangers stemming from it are trying to do is to have a wholesale attack on nature and to say that basically to destroy human society as we know it. Pope Benedict Emeritus went on to say in one of his addresses, people dispute the idea they have a nature given by their bodily identity, which serves as a defining element of the human being. They deny their nature and decide it's not something given to them, but that they make for themselves. According to the biblical creation account, man was created as male and female, and that pertains to the essence of the human creature. Duality is an essential aspect of what being human is all about, as ordained by God. Some in the West have noticed what he said. I want to be positive. Some have noticed it. This year in Poland, parish priests read a letter, and they had to read it in every parish. And it was Catholic bishops to the nation, and they read a pastoral letter called "The Dangers Stemming from Gender Ideology." And I have a few copies of it on the chair over here that has experts, not in Polish, don't worry, it's in English. But and it said, they said, among other things, the gender ideology movement is a product of many decades of ideological and cultural changes that are deeply rooted in Marxism and neo-Marxism, endorsed by some feminist movements and the sexual revolution. And it goes on to say that Poland has been assaulted now by this ideology, which was really alien to it. And he said that we're really struggling to prevent some of these ideas from taking over, really people who are quite naive about it. But I ask you, what would Martin Luther King say about this, about transgender rights, who fought so much for, human rights? What's this all about? Where did this come from, this gender agenda? Did it just appear in the last few years? Well, the answer is no. The transgender issue has been on the boil for many years. It comes from this attempt to rearrange societies that was part of the 19th century end of world feeling. This, they call it fin de siècle, the sense of an end of a world. There was really, truly, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the sense that the Judeo-Christian worldview was gone, that new societies had to be created. And that's why we have lived through, communism, Nazism, we've lived through the feminist rearrangement of society and the secular liberal view of it, which is a far more deceptive one. Now, you see, we don't only have the attack on those in the womb, fear not those who kill the body, we have those who are alive and born man and woman, fear those who kill the soul. They're the ones who are being attacked. And people's minds are being twisted. The idea is that, we're going to be very kind to people who feel that they're transgendered. So it's not the body snatchers so much as the soul snatchers. The thing is, you and I are not bystanders. We are involved. Because what we're asked to do by the society around us is not only to agree with or tolerate it, but to like it. If you don't like it, then you're really in trouble. If you don't express enough positive views, then you're probably a latent, intolerant fascist. You see, it goes like this. If you say homosexuality or transgenderism is wrong, you're drawing a distinction. You're using a principle of thought to draw a line of separation between the behaviour of gays and transgenders and putting them in an undesirable category. In this very process of distinction, you are doing what Hitler did to Jews and gypsies and gays. Therefore, you're acting like Hitler. Of course, that means you're a fascist. And that's the line of reasoning. We know there's something missing in that line of reasoning. We know that it doesn't talk about the reality of the human dignity of the human person, and it doesn't talk about the real nature of human freedom, which St. John Paul II said was one of the most misunderstood issues of our time. So just a short history about the recent past of where transgenderism came from and the very great sense of alarm about how this is infiltrating into Polish society without consent of Poles. And this is the bishop who was behind getting this pastoral out. He called gender ideology a contemporary Herod, which seeks to destroy the family. But let me just say, what's happened in recent years is that, as you know, you may or may not know, homosexuality used to be considered a disease, a disorder. Even Freud did consider it that. But it was taken out for political reasons from the manual that's used to categorise disorders. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the book that psychiatrists and clinical psychologists use to try to get a handle on some disordered behaviour. Now, gender identity disorder was always a disorder, always, until last year. So now it has been removed as a disorder and it's only called a kind of tendency. So you can see in which direction this is going. Now you might say, why have any categorisations at all? If you're mentally ill, why not just, pray about it? The reality is there is such a thing as mental disorder and mental illness, and people do try to help. They do try to help people in an era where we understand a lot more about the biochemical nature and the bases of a lot of human disease. For example, schizophrenia is a problem of the neurotransmitters and an excess of dopamine. We've got much more knowledge that occurred in the last 70 years about this. Even the exorcists, Father Amorth and Father Jose Fortea, always use psychiatrists with them because they have to distinguish between cases of demonic influence and, say, a real mental illness. So they have a role to play, but it's a question of what role they play and distinguishing what they need to do. Now, in the DSM-5, instead of saying gender identity disorder, where they call it gender identity dysphoria. And dysphoria is a really nice word. It's like when you feel unwell. Like, when you've got a headache, you feel a bit of dysphoria. So it's nothing to do with a disorder anymore. And they define it as a marked incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and assigned gender. So you don't feel well as a woman, then you can become a man tomorrow. Facebook gives you a choice of 50 genders when you apply. Among them pangender, bigender, agender, gender questioning, androgynous, cisgender and neutral. The normalising of transgenderism may have had unintended consequences in that without a diagnosis, the payment for gender reassignment may not be available under medical insurance anymore. Aha, see, medical insurance, get it for free. Not a disease, have to pay. Problem for the transgenders. Big problem. No disorder, no money. So they're not quite sure what to do now. But just to give you a bit of a background about the categorisation of mental illness, this man, Kraepelin, a German, attempted to fit all the diagnoses into a manual for the first time in 1883. Because when people were mentally ill over 100 years ago, they'd say, oh, maybe she's got hysteria, or oh, maybe, he's just a bit unwell and needs one of the health spas. They did a booming business based on no facts and knowledge at all, but they made a lot of money. And he attempted to classify that because before, people were thought of as being either holy when they were mad, as in Dostoevsky's novels, mad people, oh, they're holy and in touch with God. And now we have more definitions and more stating facts, and that, as I read out, is the definition of gender dysphoria. Now let's move forward. This gender issue became more interesting for psychologists and psychiatrists in the Kinsey era. In 1965, in the era of sexual experimentation on young children, psychiatrists and plastic surgeons at Johns Hopkins University introduced a sex change clinic. They thought this would be interesting. And I'm afraid I have to mention a New Zealand-born doctor called John Money, but he migrated to America. He became one of the founding members of this sex change clinic. He was a dedicated Kinsey disciple, and he was on the advisory board of the Kinsey Institute. And Money was that's his name, Money, but he was one of the many co-founders of this institute. And everybody was terribly proud and happy. In the 60s, they thought progress is possible, we're moving forward, we're getting bigger and better all the time. And one of the first projects that this Dr. Money took on in his sex change clinic was a little boy called David Reamer. Now, David was born in Canada in 1966. He was a healthy male, but due to some damaged sex organs because of a badly done circumcision, he was referred to Dr. Money, who reassigned him as a female from infancy onwards. David was dressed, this is Dr. Money on the right, and Dr. Harry Benjamin, another co-founder of the Gender Institute at Johns Hopkins University, a very renowned university, I might say. Very well thought of in other ways. So people wouldn't question the expertise of these people. And here's poor little David Reamer. He was actually one of a twin. He had a twin brother. He was given the name Brenda, and various operations were performed on him. Frilly dresses were put on him. And he was actually made to engage in terrible, like, sexual acts with his brother, with this Dr. John Money. But from the age of 11 onwards, little David was able to kind of start questioning this female identity. And by the age of 14, he asked not to see Dr. Money anymore. Very brave of a child whose parents are asking him to go to that doctor. He said, "I don't like it." And he found it more traumatic than therapeutic. And he then started to dress as a boy. The thing is, he was never happy after this early childhood, what I'd call sexual abuse. And in 2000, he and his brother went public. They told the media how Dr. Money had taken naked photos of both the boys when they were 7 years old, and how he forced them into acts they didn't want to do. David was traumatised. He went into surgery to try to, become more the male that he was. And he urged others never to go into this sex change, that how terrible it was. Though he got married, he suffered from terrible depressions, had mental health problems, and he committed suicide in 2002. No comment on the sad end of this project was ever made by the Gender Institute. And when people contacted some of the leading figures in the Gender Institute, they claim the media criticism was due to right-wing bias and anti-feminism and fascism and you name it. However, it did have an effect. The sex reassignment project was discontinued around 1980. It was just quietly dropped because another doctor came in to do an assessment, which is normal for most projects, and he was honest enough to say in his report, "My personal feeling is that surgery is not a proper treatment for a psychiatric disorder, and it's clear to me that these patients have severe psychological problems that don't go away after surgery." So they're the people, say, who wanted the sex reassignment. Dr. Mayer could see there was no beneficial effect. Of course, poor victims like David, who never asked for it, had their lives ruined by this. Of course, the work still continues. There's a group of very, fervent doctors who continue this work and will respond to any questions that people ask of transgenderism, and they will do the sex change operations and think it's terrible if people, stop them doing it. There's even associations formed of gender change, and they have conferences every year. This year there was one in Bangkok, Thailand, Transgender Health and Global Perspectives. But at the same time as this right is asserted, you get stories like this. A California high school student who believes he's a girl trapped in a boy's body just made it into the girls' softball team. Pat Cordova-Goff, who's 17, now has the right to play in either the male or the female team. An Australian program on the ABC, our broadcasting corporation, earlier this year showed, here is a picture of Lieutenant Malcolm McGregor. He's an army officer and cricket expert. Lieutenant Colonel McGregor was also a speechwriter and was known to many in political life, including the Catholic Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. In 2002, Lieutenant McGregor decided to become a woman. He's now Kate McGregor. And he explained in an interview that that's truly how he felt. The military has gone along with it and you dare not speak against it. And he's appeared on TV. They tricked the Prime Minister into appearing on Australian Story to introduce him, and they didn't tell him about the gender reassignment. And so the Prime Minister had to live through the shock of seeing his friend now as a woman and showing respect for him and not revealing the full extent of his reactions. He actually afterwards said, "Oh, I was so shocked, the horror of it all." But he was on public television and trying to show respect for the person rather than criticise the act of that person. And then you get tragic stories at the same time. like Mike Penner, a popular and talented sports writer, 25-year career at the Los Angeles National Times. No one will understand how and why Mike struggled and changed from identifying as Mike Penner to being Christine Daniels, nor why she ended up returning to male identity and then committed suicide. That's an issue. Suicide is a big problem. Now, this advocacy for transgender rights, I would call equivalent to, say, advocacy for lobotomies. You know, it's a medical procedure that is really harmful to the person. And when it comes out, there will be calls for the blood of these surgeons who did it. But at the moment, we're in the grip of this delusion. Unfortunately, many Christians go along with it. As I said, the Episcopalian Church in America is very sympathetic to transgenders. They're wanting to have transgender clergy. And 2 Catholic churches in the United States held a series of talks on what it's like to be transgender. And that was this year in March 2014. Talks were sponsored by All Saints Catholic Church and St. Lucy's Catholic Church in New York State. And they had all-day workshops like understanding transgender, becoming an effective ally for trans rights, and so on, and the legal rights of transgender people. Now, I think it's really apt to use that term by Pope Francis. The Catholic Church is really a field hospital after a war, during and after a war. How relevant that comment is. But let's move on now to talk about how have some people come out of this, because not all of them succumb to it. Like we have gays leaving the homosexual lifestyle and telling their stories, there's also a man who has done a tremendous lot of good. His name is Walt Heyer. Born male, became female, and then returned to being male. Walt Heyer wrote a most wonderful book called Paper Genders, and he says clearly, and became a fervent Christian. He's not a Catholic, but a very fervent Christian, and understands the biblical revelation of us as men and women. He said it's damaging and destructive to engage in sex change. He was Laura Jensen for a while before he found his way to Christ. But how did he get there? When he was minded by his grandmother, she wasn't a really very balanced person, and she dressed him in female clothing as a child. And his uncle came, and his uncle was a bully and a bit of an abuser, and when he was intoxicated, he used to kind of push the young boy, who was very delicate and sensitive, around. What happened is Walt wanted to escape the memories of this horrifying period in childhood. And one way the human mind does escape from horrifying experiences is to go into this kind of quasi-amnesia about periods. You know, like sometimes people will consciously say, I don't want to remember that, I don't want to think about that. But in reality, some people can't think of it and they don't remember it. They won't remember years of their lives if they've been abused, or maybe a bad car accident or something like that. They can also then start to develop other personalities. Actually, that disengaged amnesic state, that fugue state, is the origins of what we used to call multiple personality disorder. They call it now dissociative identity disorder, because you dissociate from who you are. And that's what happened to poor Walt. He wanted to become a girl, and then he convinced himself he was a girl. And he went and he got this sex change operation done, and went around and but that's after he had become married as a male in early life. And he told his children and his wife, I'm going to become a woman, and then went and did so. And how much trauma it caused them, and how much pain for them, because the children were totally and utterly confused. And that's the part not mentioned when this kind of gender change is promoted. What happened when his marriage had broken up and he became a woman? He became incredibly depressed, and he then had the honesty to start thinking about the issues. He started to remember in fits and starts some of the abuse in his childhood. He tells that when he finally realised what had happened, he went into a terrible crisis. And then he realised he had to help, fellow transgenders. He said, Hayat said, he personally knows of 2 recent cases where gender surgery was approved for young women, both of whom had been sexually abused by a family member. In one case, the patient's mother told the therapist about the abuse the daughter had endured. The therapist's response was, if she wants to switch genders, she can have surgery. She's 21. They didn't address the sexual abuse. So can you see how this is abuse piled on abuse because of the political agenda? Gender reassignment surgeons say that they have big success, but they actually lie about a lot of the figures. Excuse me. Hayat submitted testimony against the Massachusetts Transgender Rights and Hate Crimes Bill in 2011, saying there's nothing normal about wanting to be a different gender. In fact, there's something desperately wrong with such people. He runs a website. He contributed to articles in The Guardian here that it studies where they found that 41% of transgenders report suicide attempts. Many are prone to heavy drinking. More are homeless. Higher rates of HIV. University of Birmingham meta-study show there's no robust scientific evidence that gender reassignment surgery is clinically effective. Now, there are such studies happening, but nobody gives them a lot of prominence. They come into the paper and disappear the next day. Walt Heyer, almost single-handedly, is trying to keep the issue going and trying to warn people. He will counsel them. He has a website. And I was just going to say that he, above all, recognises that, God's plan for love and life. If you ever have to deal with people who come up to you and say, I feel like I'm gay, or if your parents whose child comes up and says that, it's a very, very difficult experience for you to go through. There are parents who've had to endure this. What do you say? You say, look, one thing is possible to say is, son, do you know how this affects us? Don't just say, I'm shocked, I'm horrified, get out of here, I don't want to know you. Just say, ask them why. Speak to them. The only chance you have of keeping them talking to you is asking open-ended questions and asking them what led to this. I mean, presumably in a family, people would notice that this had happened. Or there was some disengagement from society long before that. But sometimes people come and just make announcements. And you really have to try and keep the conversation going and try to maybe re-engage if the person is willing to listen to your suggestion, with people of the same sex. Many young men who felt that they were gay or transgender did have that kind of therapeutic intervention where they went and just had barbecues with the blokes, on a Sunday and talked together. And, it sounds simplistic, but sometimes there hasn't been a proper fit between that child and the member of the family of the same sex. It's not that there might be an absent father or an absent mother. It's that there hasn't been a good emotional connection made. And that emotional connection builds trust. And that trust then builds good communication. So if you can bring in the issue of trust and you can bring in the issue of God's plan for love and life, that's even better, but that might be further down the track. We know the words of Genesis, and I say that, maybe you can quote some scripture in a quiet tone of voice without emotional outbursts and accusations, because it usually comes as a shock for Catholics when they hear children or other members of the family have turned to being gay or transgender. Keep talking to them, keep talking, showing that you respect them as persons, because they don't understand their dignity before God yet, and you have to try to explain it to them and explain what it's about. I often think that the trust that has broken down in families, in some families, and in institutions and disorders was so great throughout the 20th and 21st centuries that Christ had to come as the divine mercy in the 1930s to a Polish nun called Sister Faustina Kowalska, because he asked and invited people to say, Jesus, I trust in you. Why? Because trust was going to be broken. Trust was going to be broken with all institutions around the place. Try to, that's Pope Francis saying, church is a field hospital after battle, but just keep emphasising that even though people may have lost trust for whatever reason, there is one that they can always trust, and that is Jesus in the divine mercy. Christ said in the diary to St. Faustina, souls that make an appeal to my mercy delight me. To such souls I grant even more graces than they ask, and sooner would heaven and earth turn to nothingness than would my mercy not embrace a trusting soul. So try to get trust and turn to the divine mercy and use your emotional common sense and nous as a parent and a friend when you meet such people. God bless you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Wanda. Absolutely fascinating talk. Johns Hopkins, Wanda mentioned the experimentation and this project. Johns Hopkins, for the last 40 or so years, has been the think tank and the nerve center of the population control program for all the world. And at one time I visited the Johns Hopkins because as a young medical student, you think of all the great fame of the great doctors who worked the greatest medical school in all history at one time. And so I went on a pilgrimage to Johns Hopkins, where such great doctors had been, and then discovered that this center, this nerve center for abortion, birth control, population control, and sexual depravity right throughout the world, through the agency of Planned Parenthood, the United Nations, and so on. And in the old entrance of the hospital, there's a huge statue of Christ, the physician, in the very center. So just little thoughts about that. And just a thought. The confusion in sexuality. People think that by changing the external genitalia, they change the sex of a person. We are not just male and female because we have different genitalia on the outside or in the inside, but every cell of our body, from the very first moment of conception, is either male or female. Every cell. That's not just the genitalia, that's the liver, that's the spleen, and so on, including brain cells. It's very simple. If you want to get the gender of a person, you don't even have to go. Any doctor in his consulting rooms can do it. All he does is put a fingernail inside the cheek of the person, scratch a few of the cells, put them on a microscope slide, stain it with a dye, and he looks for a little body called the bar body. If the bar body is there, that's a male. Bar body absent, female. Just an ordinary microscope. No DNA studies needed. But thank you very, very much. Please speak up as far as the questions are concerned. Direct your questions now to Dr. Wanda. Greg has given me the liberty of putting little remarks. Earlier on, reproductive rights. The way that reproductive rights have been used is always to bring in abortion in every country in the world. They piggyback on the so-called nobility of reproductive rights. Interesting, as Father was talking about abuse, sexual abuse. What about statutory rape? aided and abetted in every family planning clinic in this country. Aided and abetted in every consulting room where doctors give birth control devices and drugs to junior children, to children under the age of 6. They are aiding and abetting statutory rape. Now, these are the same people, of course, who accuse the Holy See of child abuse, of sexual abuse, etc. So thank you very much, Doc. I'm going to vacate this platform.
Are there any questions? Yes.
What percentage of these transsexual desirers, as it were, are actually hermaphrodites?
Oh, well, the term hermaphrodite is really a bit confusing because there are some people who, there's an island somewhere near, I think it's in the Caribbean, where there is a population of young people who, when they're born, they're female. And when they come to puberty, they turn into males. But the trouble is, they have a hormonal imbalance. This is not because it's designed by nature, it's because it's a problem. But when those people are born, they know what's going to happen. It's not a question of they desire to be a woman or a man. They know there's a problem and they wait for puberty to occur and it comes in. But as for hermaphrodite, it's really a term more used in classical mythology for, and in the ancient world. I think that nowadays it's not really used. It's that fluidity of gender is the in term, fluidity, that you can be anything you want to be. There are people with more male and more female characteristics, though they're one gender, but that doesn't mean that a man is a woman just because he's a bit effeminate, or a woman is a man because she's very, sort of active and a tomboy. As for percentages, I can't answer that. I don't know. But, we're talking about a small percentage, like with the gays, of the transgenders, probably no more than 1 or 2% of the population, but tremendous power in the media, and much is demanded of you. It's not the issue per se. It's that you have to show that you are not a fascist. That's the bottom line, that if you dare disagree with it, you're a fascist. But, I can get back to you over what percentage regard themselves as hermaphrodite, but that's not a term used in the gender selection. They're all different terms now. Yeah. Yes?
My question is about the onset of the Judeo-Christian, the revolution against the Judeo-Christian worldview that you linked to the fin de siècle about 100 years ago.
Really from probably the French Revolution onwards, but it really took form then.
What confuses me is that the real change, the popular change in the worldview came about and could scarcely agree otherwise, but the contraceptive revolution really
Yep.
in the general population. But what was the state of affairs before that?
Yeah, there were no contraceptives, but people sometimes did seek contraceptive methods, through natural herbs. People sought abortion. I mean, abortion was sought in the Roman world, in the Greek world. I mean, people did practice it, but because the technique of it wasn't so fine, it wasn't widespread, and most people did assent to the Judeo-Christian values, the worldview, and they didn't practice it. In fact, people at the end of the 19th century, feminists who wanted the vote, said it is absolutely unthinkable that a mother could kill her own child. I mean, but that view rapidly changed with the 20th century and this world building. I call it romantic world building, creating a new world order. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
In some cultures, due to poverty, there's a lot of people, like in the Far East, who become transvestites. How would they be perceived?
From my understanding, about people in the Middle East who become transvestites and how are they dealt with. I mean, I've only watched it on TV. I haven't actually met them face to face, but I understand that they're actually deliberately put into that situation because there's such a strong moral code between men and women that they're not allowed to kind of be in each other's company unless it's a male relative, and not allowed to touch each other or anything like that, there's a lot of underground kind of homosexual behaviour, and the boys are then dressed up as girls and do dancing, and it's a kind of some kind of a engagement in sexual and lustful behaviour, but I'm not very familiar with it. But I think that it's not openly acknowledged. It's one of these things that's sort of kept under wraps. Yeah.
You talked about the Marxist agenda what they want to destroy society.
Yes.
And then what do they do?
So the Marxist agenda wanted to reorganise society, and the last part?
And then what was the plan?
After that, then the people who have power keep power. I mean, that was always the agenda. In fact, there is a whole line of theoretical thinking that says that the Soviet Union planned for a post-so-called communist world. It wasn't really necessary to call the West communist because it had come to live without God and was living by communist values anyway. And some argue communism's greatest success has been in the West, not in the East. And that's what they're aiming at, this conflict between different... It's clear, men and women fighting, poor and rich, you make conflict, straight and gay and transgender and pangender and queer gender and bigender and all the rest. Get them all in conflict and you've got societal breakdown. Vladimir Putin loves it because he calls Europe gay-ropa, and the more it breaks down, the more Russia looks good. He loves this breakdown. Yeah.
It's very much thought now that the scientific truth is that so-called sexual orientation is unalterable and it's dangerous to try and change someone's so-called orientation. So I just wondered if there was a particular resource you could direct us to that had, the scientific evidence in defence of things like Christian therapy to answer that lifestyle.
Good question. There's question is about the fact that sexual orientation, is there any evidence for it, or where can you direct people to read about it from a Christian perspective? There is no gay gene. That is admitted by the gays. They desperately tried to find one. William Donohue, the American sociologist, said that once, when it was found there was no gay gene, a group of people who were anti-homosexual but not necessarily Christian said, well, if we found that people in the womb were gay, we would abort them. Upon which a whole lot of gays suddenly became pro-life. And they all started to say, you can't kill people in the womb just like that because they're gay. And he said, maybe it's the first time they became pro-life, but he said, I don't care how they become pro-life, let them become pro-life. But no, I would actually suggest the works of Nicolosi, Joseph Nicolosi. If you Google him, he's, Van Aardweg. But Nicolosi, I sort of contacted them before I came here just to get some information. They're constantly working with people and doing this coming out of the gay lifestyle. And he always says there's a psychological problem underneath it. When people talk about, I have a different sexual orientation, I always felt this way, he will go into the family dynamics. I mean, I think he's dealt with 5,000 people. He never forces it on them. He says, just if you have a problem with same-sex attraction, perhaps I can help you. He never advertises any more than that. And people come to him in droves. So, yeah, just Google Nicolosi. There's a lot of articles and papers on there, and he's successful. And also, if it's an issue of transgender, get people the book Paper Genders, or get them to Google Walt Heyer, that man I mentioned, because he's really good. He addresses points directly.